Hello,
And you are?
I'm Solange, your grandmother.
I don't have a grandmother.
Well, now you do.
At 81, the world still insists on calling me the eternal muse. They say it with admiration, with nostalgia, with that particular French longing for women who remain untouchable. But being a muse is not a destiny. It is a cage with golden bars. People believe they know me. They know the photographs, the cigarette smoke curling through black and white frames, the silk dresses, the ice-cold elegance I wore like armor. They think the silence was intentional, that the composure was effortless, that my life unfolded in perfect symmetry with the films I inhabited. But that is only the version of Catherine Deneuve the world invented, a woman sculpted by cinema, refined by myth, preserved in a time that no longer exists. The real story is more fragile, more human, more stained with shadows than the public ever allowed themselves to imagine. Across my life in film, there were four elite men, whose influence hovered over me like a private storm. Men with power, with culture, with brilliance, with reputations that could ignite careers or extinguish them. They adored me. They desired me. They tried to own parts of me I was too young, too polite, too conditioned to protect. One believed he could sculpt me like marble. Another thought he could purchase my destiny. A third, a genius intoxicated by his own darkness, wanted to claim my soul as his masterpiece. And the last wanted to shape my public image to fit his political ambitions. A partnership built not on love, but on the illusion of perfection. For decades, I kept their names in silence. Not out of fear. I have never feared men, but because the world preferred the myth of Catherine Deneuve over the truth of the woman who lived beneath that myth. People say that French women age with grace. What they forget is that grace often grows from wounds that healed slowly, quietly, without applause. Tonight, I will tell the story as it truly happened. Not the cinematic version, not the elegant rumor, not the headline that never made it to print. At 81, I owe myself the truth, more than I owe anyone my silence. And so, these are the four men, the elite men, who try to shape my life in cinema, and the woman I had to become, to escape them. I was not born to cinema. I slipped into it, quietly, delicately, like someone stepping into a cold river, unsure whether the water would embrace or devour her. My childhood was not one of fame, but of observation. I learned the world through glances, through silences, through the tension hidden in the spaces between people. France in the 1950s was a place of contradictions. Elegance layered atop melancholy, beauty hiding discipline, charm masking disappointment. I absorbed all of it before I ever touched a camera. My mother was an actress. My sister was an actress. I told myself I would not be. But cinema has a way of pulling you in gently, the way a lover does, first with curiosity, then with seduction, and finally with possession. I was barely more than a girl when I stepped into my first role, unsure, hesitant, carrying a softness the world would soon mistake for silence. And then, suddenly, everything changed. Les Parapluies de Cherbourg painted me in pastel light, made me the fragile girl with the unforgettable face the muse people wanted to protect, or to possess. After that, the image calcified, the cool gaze, the perfect cheekbones, the woman who never raised her voice. They called it elegance. They called it poise. They never wondered what it cost. With fame came the men, directors, producers, artists, politicians, men who existed in the upper layers of society, men whose shadows stretched long across the world I was entering. Their attention was not always unwelcome. Sometimes it felt flattering, even intoxicating, but it came with a pressure I could feel in my bones before I had the language to name it. I became not just an actress, but a symbol. Not just Catherine, but Deneuve. People loved to imagine me as unshakable, but the truth is that I was a young woman standing inside a hall of mirrors, each reflection showing a version of me sculpted by someone else. A director called me an enigma. A producer called me his greatest investment. A journalist wrote that my silence was a weapon. They spoke of me as if I were an artifact, not a breathing human being with doubts, fears, and desires of her own. The world adored my serenity. They did not see the loneliness. The world admired my restraint. They did not see the weight of what I held back. The world believed I chose mystery. They did not see it was my only protection. In the golden years of my career, when magazines declare me the face of French cinema, I was learning a truth that carved itself into my soul. Beauty opens doors, but also invites cages. And in those cages, for men, brilliant, powerful, cultured, began to shape the contours of my life, each in their own devastating way. But no one knew the real story. And behind the elegance the world worshipped, I was quietly breaking. He was the first to see me not as a woman, but as a possibility, a celebrated French director, the kind whose name alone filled cinemas, whose artistic vision was treated with reverence, whose ego glided through rooms like a monarch. Men like him do not ask for permission. They assume possession simply by looking at you long enough. I was very young when we met, young enough to still believe that genius came wrapped in kindness, young enough to confuse admiration with guidance, young enough to let a man shape me the way sculptors shape marble, with patience, with precision, with little regard for the stone's own will. He approached me on a set drenched in cigarette smoke and soft yellow lamps. Paris at its most cinematic. You don't act, he told me. You exist. That is your gift. I thought it was a compliment. It was not. It was the first chisel strike. He taught me how to stand, how to blink, how to tilt my chin to catch the light. He adjusted the cadence of my voice, the rhythm of my breaths, the stillness of my hands. He said he was revealing my essence. In truth, he was erasing it. When I resisted, gently, tentatively, he would smile with that indulgent expression older men reserve for young women, who have not yet learned obedience. Catherine, ma chérie, your beauty is a language. I am only teaching you how to speak it. On set, he directed me with a fervor that bordered on obsession. Every scene was a confession of his desire to mold me into his masterpiece. Every take was a reminder of his control. He knew exactly how to praise me, just enough to keep me close, never enough to let me feel equal. It took me years to understand that his affection was not for me, but for the version of me he created. The Catherine he sculpted was ethereal, mysterious, untouchable, the kind of woman who inspired men but rarely inspired herself. Behind closed doors, he spoke of destiny, of art, of what I owed the cinema. He made me believe I was chosen, not because I was talented, but because I was moldable. And in moments of stillness, when the lights dimmed and his words lingered in the silence, I began to feel myself harden, not into strength, but into stone. I eventually left him, quietly, carefully, as one slips away from a sculptor before he chips away the last piece of what makes the stone alive. But the truth remains. He was the first elite man who tried to own the woman inside me, by shaping the image everyone else would believe. He didn't arrive like a storm the way some men do. He arrived like money does, quietly, calmly, with the weight of inevitability. He was a producer, but calling him that feels too small. He belonged to that rare breed of men whose influence could be felt without being spoken, whose presence could shift the atmosphere of a room, the way a change in temperature foretells a coming winter. He was refined, educated, impeccably dressed, the kind of man who carried centuries of privilege in the way he lifted a glass of Bordeaux. We met at a dinner I had no intention of attending. He knew every person at the table and owned half of what they pretended to control. He spoke little, yet everyone listened. He looked at me as though he had been waiting for me to arrive, not as a woman, but as an investment that had finally matured. He pursued me not with flowers or declarations, but with opportunities. Scripts appeared on my doorstep. Exclusive projects were whispered to me before they reached other actresses. Directors who once wavered suddenly insisted I was their only choice. It took me too long to understand why. He wasn't building my career. He was building his ownership of it. Our relationship, if one can call it that, took place in penthouses overlooking Paris or New York. Rooms filled with velvet, oak, and a silence so thick it felt intentional. He would pour wine, ask about my ambitions, listen with genuine curiosity, and then redirect them with a gentle firmness. That felt like guidance, until I realized it was control. He never raised his voice. His power didn't need volume. It existed in contracts drafted without my consent, in meetings I didn't agree to attend, in roles I suddenly owed him for securing, in the unspoken expectation that my gratitude should translate into compliance. He once told me, "You are not like other actresses, Catherine. You don't need to fight. You only need to trust me." But trust is a delicate language, and his was written in invisible ink. When rumors emerged that I was his discovery, his creation, his property dressed in Dior and quiet elegance, I felt something inside me recoil. He hadn't stolen my talent. He had stolen my autonomy. Leaving him required a level of coldness I rarely allowed myself. I spoke one sentence, a sentence I practiced for weeks. "I will no longer be owned." He didn't argue. He didn't shout. He simply looked at me as one looks at an object that has lost its value. That was the day I learned this truth. Powerful men do not need to break you loudly. They break you by convincing you that surrender is simply the natural order of things. He was the only one I loved for his mind, before I ever loved him for anything else. They called him a genius, a word too often used for men who create beautifully and destroy quietly. He was a filmmaker, a poet, a philosopher of shadows. He lived in a loft that smelled of tobacco, turpentine, and the kind of loneliness artists wrap themselves in like a blanket. He spoke about cinema as if it were a religion, about beauty as if it were a wound, and about me as if I were an idea he had been searching for his entire life. I should have known then that being an idea is far more dangerous than being a woman. Our affair was intoxicating from the beginning. Nights in Montparnasse cafes, conversations that spiraled into dawn, arguments that felt like foreplay, silences thick with meaning. He looked at me not with desire, but with fascination, the kind that makes you feel observed, rather than understood. He wanted me in his films. Yes, but more than that, he wanted me in his mythology. He believed in the tortured muse, the fragile goddess, the woman whose pain fueled his art. And slowly, subtly, he began to nurture the wounds he needed in me. If I was confident, he called it arrogance. If I was tired, he called it emotional truth. If I cried, he kissed my tears like inspiration. If I was strong, he pushed until I shattered. Genius, I learned, can seduce you with brilliance and then devour you in the dark. Once after a grueling shoot, I found myself trembling in a dressing room, overwhelmed, exhausted, suffocating under the weight of his expectations. He slipped inside without knocking, knelt before me, and whispered, "Don't fight it, Catherine. Your suffering is where your beauty comes from." I should have run. But love, when entwined with art, becomes a dangerous kind of worship. Our final argument was operatic. Two egos, two wounds, two storms colliding in a small Paris apartment. He accused me of abandoning his vision. I accused him of trying to own my soul. Both accusations were true. When I left him, he wrote me letters, dozens of them, filled with poetry, rage, longing. I kept none, not out of spite, but because they felt like anchors meant to drag me back into the water. Years later, people still call him a genius, and he was. But he taught me this: brilliance is not love, and a man who worships your pain will never cherish your peace. He was the only one among them whose power did not come from art or money, but from reputation. A man of letters, a political figure, a cultural icon whose voice shaped public opinion, the way the Seine shapes its own banks. In France, we call men like him les hommes publics, public men, men who belong not to themselves, but to the image the nation constructs around them. We met at an event celebrating French cinema and literature, the kind of evening drenched in champagne, old chandeliers, and conversations layered with wit and performance. He approached me with a warmth that felt practiced, but a curiosity that felt real. He spoke to me not as an actress, but as an equal, a woman with a mind worth listening to. It was disarming. It was dangerous. Our connection formed not in darkness, but in intellect, in debates about culture, politics, memory, identity. He was brilliant, and brilliance has always been my weakness. Unlike the others, he did not try to shape my art. He tried to shape my life. We saw each other in apartments overlooking Paris rooftops, in discreet restaurants where journalists pretended not to stare, in rooms filled with books, where he spoke about the world, as if he alone understood its architecture. He admired my independence, but feared it too. He once told me, "Catherine, you are too free for the role people expect you to play." I laughed. He didn't. As our relationship grew, so did the expectations around it. His advisors urged caution. The public adored speculation. Every gesture, every dinner, every glance was interpreted as a political statement. I stopped being Catherine and became a narrative. He wanted my image, the elegance, the mystique, the cinematic aura woven into his public identity, not maliciously, but naturally, the way powerful men assume the world will bend to accommodate their trajectory. He began to suggest how I should dress when we went out, which events I should avoid, what interview questions I should deflect, for the sake of preserving appearances. At first, I thought it was care. Later, I recognized it as curation. One evening, after a gala where our presence sparked headlines, he said softly, "The public sees us as a perfect union. Why not give them what they want?" It was the most elegant prison sentence I had ever heard. I realized then that he didn't love me. He loved the idea of me, and he wanted that idea to serve a purpose. I ended things gently, with a kind of grace he respected but didn't expect. He looked at me as though I had betrayed, not him, but the story he had planned for us. Years later, our names still occasionally appear together in speculative articles, but only I know the truth. He was not the man who tried to control my art, but the man who tried to control my identity, and believed he was doing me a favor. People often assume that my story is defined by the men who desired me, directed me, shaped me, or attempted to claim me. The sculptor, the mogul, the genius, the public man, for figures as different as seasons, yet bound together by one unspoken belief, that Catherine Deneuve could be guided, molded, directed, owned. For decades, I allowed the world to believe this version of me, the enigmatic muse, the woman carved from quiet elegance, the actress who slipped through men's fingers like smoke. It was easier than explaining the truth, easier than revealing the fractures beneath the porcelain, easier than admitting how much I concealed just to stay whole. But here is the truth I kept hidden longer than any affair, any scandal, any whispered rumor that danced through Parisian cafes or Hollywood lounges. I was never theirs, not for a moment, not even when I loved them. What they mistook for compliance was distance. What they saw as mystery was self-preservation. What they believed was surrender was simply a woman choosing silence over spectacle. You see, I grew up in a world that adored women like me, only when we were quiet, controlled, composed, beautiful first, complex second, powerful only when our power served someone else's narrative. So I learned to survive by disappearing in plain sight, by letting them believe they understood me, by offering just enough of myself to keep them enthralled, but never enough for them to own anything real. The sculptor believed he created me. He never did. The mogul believed he controlled my future. He never could. The genius believed he unlocked my soul. He barely scratched the surface. The public man believed he shaped my identity. He shaped only the story he told the world. What none of them realized, what I never allowed them to see, was that the quietest woman in the room is often the one holding the sharpest truth. And the truth is this: I built my life by choosing myself, rejecting their version of me, and reclaiming every piece they tried to sculpt, fund, romanticize, or curate. It took me years, decade really, to understand that the freedom I sought was never something they could grant or take away. At 81, I no longer feel the need to protect their names, their reputations, or their illusions, but I also feel no desire to expose them. They were chapters, not definitions. The final truth is not about them. It is about me. I remained unpossessed, unclaimed, unbroken. This is the truth I can only say now. At 81, when the world's gaze feels lighter, and my voice, for the first time, feels entirely my own. It happened one autumn night in Paris. The kind of night when the city glows gold against the cold, and every window seems to hold a story you are not part of. I had just returned from a gala, draped in couture and diamonds, surrounded by applause that felt scripted, conversations that felt rehearsed. People told me I looked magnificent, perfect, untouchable. But perfection is the heaviest mask a woman can wear. When I stepped into my apartment, the silence felt like a punishment. I poured a glass of champagne I didn't want, set it on the marble counter, and walked toward my vanity, the one place in the world where truth refuses to hide. The mirror caught me in its harsh honesty. My makeup flawless, my posture regal, my eyes exhausted. I stared at the woman reflected there, the icon, the enigma, the symbol of French elegance, and felt a sudden, overwhelming dissonance. She looked like Catherine Deneuve, but she did not look like me. I lifted a hand to my cheek. Even my touch felt like it belonged to someone else. For a moment, I could hear all four men again. Their instructions, their expectations, their interpretations of who I should be. Their voices, so different in tone, blended into one single verdict. You are who he made you. Something inside me cracked. The breath left my body in a tremor. I cannot control. The glass in my hand slipped to the floor, shattering into a constellation of tiny diamonds. And then, before I could stop myself, the tears came. Not delicate tears, not cinematic tears, but deep, sharp sobs pulled from a place I had buried. Decades earlier, I felt like a ghost. I whispered to my reflection, a confession I had never made aloud. A ghost who drifted through red carpets and film sets. A ghost applauded for her silence. A ghost desired for a woman she no longer recognized. The world forgot me. I said next, my voice breaking. But even as the words left my lips, the deeper truth hit me with brutal grace. I had forgotten myself first, piece by piece, film by film, expectation by expectation. I sank to the floor, gown pooling around me like fallen silk, the city lights casting trembling shadows across the walls. It felt like mourning, not for a person, but for the woman I might have been, if the world had ever allowed me to simply exist, without being sculpted, owned, romanticized, or displayed. For the first time in my life, I let myself fall apart, completely, unapologetically, beautifully, because sometimes a woman must break to finally remember. She was never meant to be silent marble. The morning after my collapse, Paris felt different, not softer exactly, but clearer. The world outside my window moved with a quiet dignity, as if the city understood that I had finally reached a moment I had spent a lifetime avoiding. I brewed coffee, strong, bitter, honest, and sat by the tall window overlooking the boulevard. The steam curled upward like a pale ribbon, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to simply sit. No appointments, no performance, no expectation, just breath, just presence, just Catherine. Healing, I learned, does not come in grand revelations. It arrives in subtleties. The way sunlight settles on an old parquet floor, the way your chest loosens after a night of weeping, the way silence shifts from loneliness into sanctuary. I began making choices I once believed I was not allowed to make. I declined roles that demanded my pain as currency. I accepted projects that delighted me, rather than defined me. I stopped appearing in rooms where my elegance mattered, more than my comfort. I traded diamonds and soirees for walks along the Seine, and dinners cooked slowly in my own kitchen. I reconnected with old friends, real friends, the ones who remembered me before I became an icon. We talked for hours in smoky cafes, laughing at stories that once felt too heavy to tell. In their company, I rediscovered pieces of myself I thought I had buried beneath decades of poise and silence. I forgave the sculptor, who taught me that beauty without autonomy is simply another form of captivity. I forgave the mogul, who mistook possession for protection. I forgave the genius, whose brilliance blinded him to the damage he inflicted. I even forgave the public man, who believed he was shaping a partnership, when he was only shaping a narrative. But most importantly, quietly, slowly, with the tenderness I had denied myself for too long. I forgave me, for the silence, for the compliance, for the performances I gave off camera, for the years I spent trying to be the woman they preferred, instead of the woman I was. I no longer chase mystery. It arrives naturally now, in silver hair, in softened laughter, in eyes that have seen too much, but still manage to find light. At 81, I no longer belong to the industry, to the past, or to the stories others wrote for me. I belong to myself, to my craft, my history, my contradictions, my quiet rebellions, to the simple, profound freedom of existing without explanation. I'm still here, still elegant, still fierce, still unmistakably Catherine. But now, finally, I am mine.